Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by my fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to talk about Steven Spielberg's The Fabelmans. Before we begin, Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original podcast, meaning that on Nebula you can listen to all of our episodes ad-free and a week early. And you'll also get access to monthly bonus episodes. This month, that's Damien Chazelle's Babylon. Be sure to use our personal link, that's nebula.tv/cinema of meaning, which you can also find in the show notes, to get a $20 discount on a yearly subscription. Now, on to Fabelmans. Thomas, you already got to see Fabelmans last year. Here it just released last week, so I've only seen it just the once. A few days ago, I'm still going on like that first impression.
Yeah.
How about you? Did you get a chance to see it a second time or also just the once?
Yeah, I rewatched it yesterday and saw this one back in December and had a really fun time. I think it's fun to see someone like Steven Spielberg kind of tell a very personal, intimate story after he's done, all this. I don't know. It's a little bit like not out of character for him, but I think like this is a different movie than kind of what we're used to from Steven Spielberg. But it a little bit feels like he's kind of earned it at this point. Like he can do this if he wants to. At this point in his career, he can look back on sort of his own life. And I think that's very interesting from a director like this. Like, he could have written a book or a memoir or something, but instead we kind of get this very personal sort of biopic, but also, it's still a Steven Spielberg movie. So it has a lot of the charm and sort of the good filmmaking set pieces, the way in which he's conveying this sort of like smaller scale personal story is also kind of only in the way that really he could and that we're used to from his work. It's kind of a unique little movie in its own right that I had a lot of fun watching. What did you think about it? First impression wise, obviously we're going to...
I also liked it a lot. It was a lot funnier than I expected.
Yeah.
At least in the theater that I was in, like there was an old couple next to me and they were just like bickering throughout the movie. Like even at some of the moments where I felt like it wasn't maybe intended to be funny. Like the overall vibe was very, not necessarily lighthearted, but it didn't have that kind of self-seriousness that you could easily expect when a filmmaker goes introspective like this.
Yeah.
I admire that he, at the same time, it made it very personal, but at the same time, it also felt like he had some distance between the story, between his own history, and between his artistic voice that also wants to entertain and that wants to create this magical world for an audience that, might not even care about his personal story to get lost in, because, at no point, like I had a conversation about this with my partner and she doesn't know, like, she knows the name Steven Spielberg, but beyond that, she doesn't know much about him. And she was like, oh, does it say in the movie that it's like based on his story? And I was like, oh no, I don't think it even did. Like, I'm not sure that it was said anywhere like, oh, this is a true story. This is based on whoever, like an ode to mom or dad. I don't think there was anything like that in the movie. And so to the average moviegoer who may have heard of the name Steven Spielberg, or maybe even not at all, someone who just goes in to casually enjoy movies, it's, the Steven Spielberg's personal history doesn't matter to someone like that.
Right.
And I feel like he was aware of this. And so he also made sure like, okay, I'm going to tell my story, but I'm going to do it through the voice that I also use to tell all these other stories that people connected with so well or so deeply.
Yeah.
That to me was fascinating, that he kind of told his own story through this own, like filtered through his own artistic lens, which had this really interesting result. I'm not sure if there's like how I feel about it as to like if this is the right direction for a biographical story, like, or let me put it like this. I'm not sure what the intention is on Steven Spielberg's end. Does he really want us to see this as something that's deeply personal to him? Or does he just want us to see the story and not discuss it in the context of his personal history.
Right.
Like, does he want it to stand on his own, or does he actively want people discussing this movie in terms of, oh, this is like the Steven Spielberg story. This is his personal history. I'm not sure it matters too much.
Right.
Either way.
We're going to talk about it.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with it either way. I think he made it universal enough also to have it be relatable for a number of different reasons for anyone who has that kind of the passion that's depicted in there. Like in the movie, we see a young Sammy, the kind of Steven Spielberg insert character, Sammy Fabelmans. He develops this love for movies, but we also see the struggles with his family, which are also in many ways, even if you don't have like the exact experience that he had, like struggling with a divorce, with moving from town to town, like there's still a little bits and pieces there that I think are universally relatable and that make this movie just a very relatable portrait of what it means to be a child that has a passion and to kind of protect it in a way as you grow up and come to face the reality of life where you have to make do with like other responsibilities, where you're kind of stuck between am I going to pursue this, or am I going to get a real job, so to say, or the kind of the classic struggle of the artist in that sense.
Well, to respond to a couple things you said, I was also surprised by how funny it is. It has a sort of like theatricality that I don't think I was expecting necessarily. That it's not to say that Spielberg's other films aren't theatrical in a sense, but there was almost a heightened, I don't know what to call it exactly, but there's pieces of this movie that felt almost like something out of a Coen Brothers film, where he tips into this like goofy sort of territory in a way that I found really delightful, but also which I think I wasn't expecting going in. So that was interesting. And yeah, I think it is very funny. On how it relates to his personal life, I was kind of surprised to learn, listening to interviews and stuff about this, how much of it actually is directly kind of ripped from his life. I didn't know that much context going into it, besides Steven Spielberg making a movie kind of about himself vaguely. And you see things like, getting into spoiler territory here, but the big moment where he kind of discovers his mother's sort of quasi pseudo affair with this other guy in the camping trip footage. There's interviews where he talks about it. The main one I listen to is there's a Directors Guild Association podcast interview where Paul Thomas Anderson interviews Steven Spielberg. It's really interesting. Anyone who's interested in Spielberg's story in relation to the movie, I recommend. But he talks openly about that, like that actually happened. He actually discovered this like element like through footage. When I watched that, I thought for sure that has to be sort of a poetic interpretation of him discovering sort of this dramatic conflict in his parents' marriage. And so it's the story of Steven Spielberg in a very romantic context. So of course he finds it while he's actually like editing footage together. But according to Spielberg, that literally happened. And then also, the scene at the end with John Ford, like according to Spielberg, that's like word for word what John Ford said to him. So there was a lot of moments in here where also, it's not unbelievable. If you've watched anything with John Ford, it's pretty on point. It's interesting to think about this movie in that context of watching it. It feels almost like this fairy tale version of, and I'm sure there are elements that are that way. Like it's not, this naturalistic direct adaptation of his life. It's movieized, obviously, to some extent. But I think I was surprised by how much of it actually kind of is coming directly from his personal life.
Yeah, while still having that distinct Spielbergian atmosphere. Like, I think we talked about that on the Jurassic Park episode, where the kind of movie reality that Steven Spielberg creates, where a movie feels very grounded and you kind of buy into the reality, but you're also simultaneously aware that you're watching a movie, like something that kind of exists in its own realm.
Yeah.
And I felt like this was here too. Like, I'm trying to think of specific moments or scenes that would kind of illustrate this, but it's always this kind of underlying, the way he depicts high schoolers, for example, it kind of reminded me of West Side Story. There's that
Right.
slight added theatricality to it in
Yeah.
the way people, like characters move, or the way the camera moves. There's a certain flow to it. And, the shot where I think it's when Sammy is a little bit older and he's about to film his first movie. And that's the shot where all the guys are in these Boy Scouts uniforms and they're on the bicycles, and like all that feels like classic Spielbergian, even though I cannot really point my finger at, or like put my finger on what exactly it is. Is it just that it's shot on film, or that it is kind of color graded in that classical sense, or
it's the horizon is at the bottom.
Yeah.
Or the top. That's the whole thing, apparently. No, I think to something else you were talking about too, like he obviously, sorry, we're jumping around a little bit here. We'll get it focused in eventually, but we're zeroing in on sort of the thematic meat. But like, to go back to something else you were saying, I think he understands, because he's this master storyteller and understands how to set up characters and stakes really well. He understands the elements of his own life that, or at least in teaming up with Tony Kushner, who helped him write this, they together understood the elements of his own life that were going to be more universal and interesting and dramatic beyond just, hey, I'm Steven Spielberg, so you should care about my life and how I became a director. And I feel like the way it handles that aspect of the story, actually sort of like his own relationship to filmmaking, is really interesting too, because he really sidesteps kind of treating it as if he fell into this like destiny of, oh, I'm following this path to become, I was destined to become this great filmmaker. It would be really easy, I think, in hindsight, to kind of like set a story up in a way that makes it feel like that is the case. But instead, he shows his path into that as much more like flawed or not flawed, but just kind of emotionally fraught, and being this kind of like response to certain things that are happening in his life, and something he didn't have this like great confidence in. And I found that to be really relatable and such a wonderful way of presenting that path for him.
I think that's also maybe because at first he really presents his initial journey, like the development of his initial passion, as kind of carefree and purposeless, as just like, I'm a small boy and I'm interested in doing this, so I'm going to do this with my friends. I can imagine that at that time there weren't any big stakes attached to that. It was just like, oh, I'm having fun with the camera. We're just doing our hobby, doing our thing, doing something that we love.
Don't call it a hobby. Don't call it a hobby.
I think, but at that point, as a child, you don't have your eye on the future in the way that an adult has, or that you develop later in life, where you really come into that struggle of, okay, now I'm going to have to be somebody. I'm going to have to get a job, or have to have a career, and I have to make life choices. But there's that initial phase in your life that I personally also remember very well, where you're just kind of pursuing these passions sometimes with like a genuine, like real passion and dedication that you almost envy when you get older and look back on, like, how did I lose that, And you do all that without a clear like purpose, or like without, you do it just for the sake of it. And that's where we can kind of jump into like the beginning point of the film and really kind of start narrowing down some of the thematic elements.
Right.
I just love the way that was depicted. One of the first scenes is Sam just getting this. He's being brought along to this movie, and there you have this scene with a train that derails, and that kind of starts haunting him a little bit. There's just an image of that sticks in his mind. I'm not sure if it was intended to be like necessarily traumatic, like that it's something that scared him, or that it was just something that fascinated him, in the sense that like he was wondering, how did they make this, or how did they do this, and then kind of with the model trains discovering like, hey, I can recreate this too, like I can also bring this into being. And then the moment he starts to capture that, his mom initially wants to do it as a sort of therapy. Like, I think because she thinks it's him trying to control fear, but
Right.
I'm not sure if you took that like at face value, or that you were like, maybe that's the parents projecting issues on him, whereas he might just have been already being fascinated to some extent with the kind of the art of creation. And because when he edits the movie, like he's not just capturing the train derailing and then having that be that, he says he has to do it multiple times and it's edited and there's like angles and there's like already there's storytelling in the way he depicts it, or the way he crafts this quote unquote like trauma video.
Yeah.
So that to me is already where I felt like there was more going on than we were being told as an audience.
Yeah. I think in that regard, I think the movie is really setting him up as kind of a synthesis between his parents. At the beginning, there's that really interesting scene where they're trying to convince him to go into the movie. He doesn't want to go in because he's kind of freaked out. His dad, Bert, played by Paul Dano, kind of pulls him to the side and explains how movies work. There's projector, it's 24 frames, et cetera, et cetera. And then it kind of like pans over and his mom is like, movies are dreams that come alive, or something like that. And it kind of portrays these two, this like artist brain side and this engineer brain side of things. It is kind of showing throughout the film his own personal attraction to both of those elements in filmmaking. And so my interpretation of, at least watching it the second time, of those scenes was, I think there is a little element of he's afraid of it and he's trying to understand it and cope with it through capturing it on film. Because I think, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but I think that plays into some of the overall themes where he's doing that then again later throughout his life with other things as well, where he's kind of filming them as a way to sort of cope, maybe not cope, but cope makes it sound negative, but grapple with the reality of what's happening and try to kind of contain it or make it feel safe, like his mother says. I do think there's an element of that there, but I think you're on to something in that beyond that, he's also very interested in the technique, the engineering of it. Like, he has that part of his dad in him as well, where it's fun for him to just figure out how to take it apart and put it together. Yeah, so I think maybe his mom is seeing it as only sort of what she's projecting on to that moment, but it contains both of those things simultaneously. This episode of Cinema of Meaning is brought to you by NordVPN. NordVPN is a VPN that I've been using for years, and it's incredibly easy to use across all your devices. They have thousands of very fast servers that you can choose from to help protect your privacy and security online. One of the very useful things you can do with a VPN is sometimes unblock region-locked content on streaming services. Because Tom and I live in different countries, doing this podcast can be a little bit difficult sometimes because different movies are available in different places at different times and released at different dates on different streaming services. With NordVPN, you can switch your location to a different country, and that can give you access to different catalogs that different streaming services have. Go to nordvpn.com/cinemaofmeaning to get a huge discount off of the 2-year plan, and you can try NordVPN completely risk-free with their 30-day money-back guarantee. Again, that's nordvpn.com/cinemaofmeaning, or click the link in the show notes to start protecting your privacy online today.
Yeah, I like the way the parents were not... They kind of fit into archetypes, but at the same time, there was also more nuance to them that made them more than just stubborn dad wants his son to ditch the hobby to get a real job. And mom's just kind of floaty and dreamy and disappointed in not having chased her dreams. But yeah, I like the idea that the kind of synthesis between them, where he's kind of captured by both elements, that in the way that both of those elements come together and essentially create the movie magic that he got so interested in and eventually succeeded at creating so well. Because it's obviously both very, you have to be very resourceful on a technical level. You also see that when he's shooting his first, like he's shooting that war movie
Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah. He kind of shows how it's done, like the way, like he has the planks and there's like soldiers step on it, and then on the back side there's like dust that flares up, and that's what looks like an explosion. And even before that, with the Western he makes, like he has like the little actors, like they're shooting the guns, but there's obviously they're fake guns and it doesn't look real, so he's kind of frustrated, and that's when he figures out like if he makes little holes in the film, I'm not sure how that works, it's just like maybe more light gets through for a second.
Yeah.
Then and that's his purely like his dad, like something that his dad would do, like looking at this mechanically and how can we bring this into being, like how can we fix this in technical terms. And then that obviously combines with his mom's energy and her whole kind of fascination with the more dreamlike aspect of it all. And so that might just be like also be just a pure passion just to create or just to make something that's not necessarily reflected as directly as like some little moment of ingenuity with regards to some technical aspect of his film, but more like just the passion that connects him to that in the first place. And also more generally, I kind of like the way it shows how such a passion, like in those early moments in the movie, it kind of just seems to happen accidentally. It's not like, it doesn't show Spielberg as being born with this predetermined gift or passion for cinema, but it's just like this little thing in your childhood captures your fascination, and then 50 years later, like your life is defined by it. Like how does that happen? That's something I think a lot about when I see people of any kind of passion, like people who pursue anything, and even my own, like why do I love movies so much? Like it's not something that I particularly grew up with. Like my parents are both kind of casual movie watchers. It's not something that I was directly like or explicitly like instilled with. So I've often wondered like where did that come from? Like is it just because one random day in my childhood I saw a movie that did something like that made something click within me, and I still haven't been able to let go of that? Or I don't know.
I think about that too as well, and I think that's kind of what I was getting to earlier too, to some extent, is that I like that he's exploring that aspect of his story in this way in this movie. There's a lot of successful people that when they get to tell their story, there's this tendency to want to express your own story in a certain way, which has this kind of magical quality to it. And this story kind of feels magical in a sense in how it's told, but Spielberg isn't coming out here and saying, like you said, I was born with a movie reel in my hand, with a Bullets in my hand. It's like, at least in America, I very much grew up with a culture that's like, you have this one passion that we don't know where it comes from, but it's kind of just like lodged deep in your brain, or like God gave it to you or something. And if you can figure out what that is and then you follow that, you're set for life. That'll be your like golden ticket. And I like that this runs counter to that a little bit, where it's like it's showing us those little steps along the way, which I think is actually much, much closer to how things work in reality, where there's these little pieces that just build up through our childhood or through our life that we end up, that push us towards pursuing a certain thing. As we pursue that thing, it becomes your passion. It's not the passion that like makes you into that thing necessarily. So I find that to be, I don't know. I just liked that it showed us that.
There's a quote from the father that he at some point says, if you love something, that's not enough. You also have to take care of it. Or I don't remember exactly what he said, but that kind of felt relevant to what you were saying. That I guess that's more the second phase in his story. Like we have that initial phase of kind of pinpointing the triggers to whatever defined your passion. And as you said, like I like that it was shown as this more happenstance kind of thing, and not like it was all meant to be from the very start. And it's the best way to put it is that I liked it that it began with not with passion or destiny or even with like the promise of talent, but more with curiosity. That is just like little Steven Spielberg saw a train derail and he thought like, how does that work? And that's Jurassic Park, Saving Private Ryan, and Schindler's List later. That's where we are. that, as you said, like a lot of when a lot of artists or successful people tend to tell their own story, I feel like they're kind of going back with that benefit of hindsight and go to those early days, and they, instead of kind of showing them as they are or as they were, they show them as like these were the signs, these were these, whatever like success I have now, it can be attributed to those little magical moments in my childhood. But whereas in reality, it's more like, oh, I kind of developed a curiosity for this thing, and then that grew into a fascination, and that moving into the second phase, then that kind of, I nurtured it and kind of worked towards it, and then I developed it into a skill, even later into a career. We don't even see the career part really in the movie. Like, it almost feels like the epilogue where he barely begins, like takes his first step into Hollywood. But I think overall it's just kind of more the internal journey of getting him like ready to actually begin that career path and to actually begin the hero's journey, almost as it were, toward that would eventually lead to success. Yeah. Because I think he also knows like no one is that interested in the actual, like everything that happens after the movie is just that's Wikipedia stuff.
That's the stuff you can save for the like biography that somebody writes for film people specifically, like I'll read it one day and somebody will like lay out all the nitty gritty of how all the movies were filmed. So some people have interest in that, but that's not going to be the like broad mass appeal story and also I think he has an awareness that most people we already know that story. Like, it's like, we see at the end, we see Sammy walk off into the distance and we're like, oh, he becomes Steven Spielberg. Like, that we can kind of like add together, we know where it's going a little bit.
It does feel somewhat, to some extent, like the untold story and more like the inner journey for someone before they get to the point where they get like the actual success, which, it's a clever move just because that's the point that people can still relate to and maybe still find inspiration in. If it was just like if the movie began with where it ends now, and then it would become this more specific story about him trying to make his way through the studios. I don't know exactly how his life went from there. Yeah. But I know the results, and I agree that wouldn't have been as dramatically interesting probably. I'm sure he could make a dramatically interesting movie out of that. He is Steven Spielberg after all, but I like this more personal, more introspective aspect that we got instead. Because you also get to see more about like the family stuff, which just makes it more than just a movie about the craft and the passion and
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting about how he is kind of portraying his relationship with this sort of artistic medium, or his eventual career and his journey into that, is it's kind of intertwined with family. We already talked about how kind of the interests, you can see how the interests or the mindset of his two parents kind of come together to form this interest in filmmaking, the sort of combination of artistry and engineering. But then, so that's kind of at the beginning, but then there's also this process of, it's his filmmaking that accidentally unveils conflict that then he has to deal with. But then I think like there's this very interesting thing where he's making this camping trip video. He kind of discovers this affair sort of, and then we see him kind of leverage that when he's filming the World War II film. When he's talking to that kid and kind of giving direction to the main actor, he's talking about, they're your family and, you made this mistake and they're all dead now because of you. You can see how he's kind of harnessing like his personal life into the art. And these two things are like always reflecting off of each other in kind of how he's pursuing things. And then there's also this big moment where when his parents finally kind of announce they're getting a divorce, there's this moment where he sort of sees himself like filming. He sees part of that moment from the perspective of himself filming it, which I think is very interesting when you think about the fact that that's literally kind of what he's doing with this movie, is going back to those events and portraying them on film. And so I was curious what you thought about that, and maybe what some of that stuff says about how art relates to our own personal journeys, or how we use it to sort of like process our own experiences and those kinds of things.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that moment, because for me that was probably like the pivotal moment of part of that segment of the movie, if not the movie entirely.
Yeah.
Because I feel like we talked about that first section of the film, and then going into the second part, it felt to me at first like they were going to do this setup, like, because they talk about, the distinction or the opposing forces between family and art, and how they tear you apart. And
oh, yes. That great scene where the uncle, I forget his name, comes in, and
Uncle Boris.
Uncle Boris. I love Uncle Boris.
Anyway. Yeah, but I thought that was going to be the cliched kind of like, if you want to do the art, you're going to have to sacrifice your personal connections and or your family life or whatever, and which I think is a kind of a contrived approach to art and success. Like, it kind of feels like the American way, like you have to dedicate your 100% to this and sacrifice everything else, and only then can you be successful, only then can you be truly passionate about something. But I like that it didn't go in that direction. I like that it felt to me like a more nuanced comment on how developing a passion, especially one in an art form like film, that it becomes a way, it becomes a part of your identity, in the sense that becomes in part how you express yourself and how you perceive the world around you. And so that's why I love that moment so much, about where he sees himself filming his own family, like this big traumatic event. I didn't see it so much as Steven Spielberg, like commenting on the weirdness of him making a movie about his own life, but for me, it felt like, I guess that's there like symbolically, but I saw it more as something that Sammy was feeling like in that immediate moment. There's a certain disconnect between him and the reality of his family, or maybe just his family life, which is also kind of that conflict between art and the other stuff.
Yeah.
Where he kind of starts to see life in real time as a movie almost, and kind of has that lens. Like, if you continuously looking at stories and thinking about angles and thinking about dramatic turns and whatnot, then you inevitably start seeing that in your own life too, I think. I'm not sure about you, but after we've both been video essayists for some years, like we've both been quote unquote filmmakers to some extent. You more than I, but because you've made actual movies, but
I don't know if I'd call them that, but close. Yeah. I've come close.
I've had that where I've been in like personal situations, and I was immediately like, I was ingesting them as I would like ideas for a video. Like I would be to some extent distanced from them. And I think that to me was kind of what was meant here with that struggle between art and family, or just art and the personal stuff, that you kind of you put a piece of yourself in art, but then at the same time that means that you do lose that part in the personal side. So you do make a sacrifice, but on the one hand to gain something on the other, because that's the other part of it too. Like it's not only a sacrifice on the family side, but it also it gains a new form of expression that you would otherwise not have if you didn't develop like that kind of art form. And I think that's you see that a little bit, where instead of telling his mother that he knows about the affair, he kind of shows it to him. He shows what he saw. In a way, he shows what he sees as a person through what he captured as a filmmaker. And you kind of see that later on too, with the whole high school drama about, he goes to this new school, he encounters like these anti-Semitic high schoolers who kind of bully him. And then he ends up connecting with one of them because of what he shows to him, like not as a person, but as an artist. And so I feel like that's an interesting like dynamic between how you essentially split you kind of split yourself in two, as I guess the movie did explicitly say, and there's benefits to that, but it also has like downsides to it.
Yeah. That was maybe one of my favorite aspects of this movie, was how he handles sort of filmmaking itself kind of as a subject matter or idea, where he's showing kind of the magic of it and the joy that he has engaging with this process, and how it can be this tool sort of in your own life for expression. But then he's also kind of showing it in this flawed light of, in that moment, especially towards the end where he's screening that film he's made, he's constructed this image of the beach trip, the high school beach day. He's presenting this image of what it is with, the popular kids with the sunlight streaming through their hair, and they're playing volleyball, and, the guys and the girls together. And meanwhile, like, he is kind of personally disconnected from that. Like, while he's screening it, everybody's cheering and clapping, and it's like his girlfriend has dumped him. His ability to sort of capture and present that it does create a connection with that kid who he kind of makes the main character. I forget his name, Logan, I think it is. It does create a little bit of a connection with Logan, but it doesn't, just because he can like look at it and present it in a certain way, it doesn't magically sort of make him a part of it. And it kind of shows how he has to be sort of outside of it. He has to be sort of not one of those kids in order to be the one like capturing it and presenting it in a certain way. So I don't know. I mean, I might be reading like more into that than is there, but I feel like there's this very like gentle sense with which he's handling filmmaking in this movie, and like not making it more than what it is, like not trying to exalt it into being this thing that like gonna save the world or like fixes everything, or magically puts everything back together. It's just this presence in his life that, like you said, has its upsides and its downsides, allows you to communicate some things more clearly, but also can sort of distract you or separate you from moments of life that you might want to be able to be present in, or something like that. I don't know. I think some of that is I'm reading my own experience into it, where, like you said, I think most people who have done a certain kind of creative work eventually grapple with that on some element, where it's like, some days I watch movies and all my brain is doing is like, what video could I make about this? And I'm like, I'm not actually enjoying the movie. I'm just sitting there like dissecting it, pulling it apart as I'm watching it to see what's interesting about it. And there's times when that's fun, but there's also times when I really don't like that. And I'm like, I just want to actually watch a movie. I don't want to be like, I actively kind of try to resist that a lot of the time, because I just want to actually experience the thing for what it is. I guess I found that whole portrayal very, very relatable to how I've experienced like trying to do different creative endeavors.
I'm thinking of that confrontation scene where after the beach day video, the Logan guy kind of confronts Sam about like, why did you do that? Like, why did you portray me as such? And he doesn't really like it's almost as if Sam seems surprised by the question, like that he doesn't have, that's just how he sees or how he saw it, or that's just he films and that's it. It kind of touched on that. I maybe saw it a little bit more positive than you did, in the sense that, there's the part of you where that analytical voice can distract from an experience. But for me, it can also be a way to, like a bridge to draw closer to it. Like, for example, when I'm traveling, when I'm on a holiday, and I've had a few like vacations now, like recent ones, where I want to make this holiday movie. Like I want to kind of capture it and then edit it together. And so during the holiday, there's obviously going to be a lot of moments where or even when I'm not even bringing a camera along, like I'm looking at the space, like the physical spaces, and I'm looking for like compositions, even though I have no intention of like capturing them. But I feel like my eye naturally goes there. And when I am filming, like I feel like, there's the cliche, like, oh, if you're just filming the whole thing or just constantly looking at the thing through a screen, then you're not really connecting with it. But for me, it does feel like it gives me like a purpose to interact with the space in a way that I wouldn't if I would just kind of wander through it,
Yeah.
like aimlessly taking it in, or sort of mindlessly just perceiving it or observing it. And I feel like when I have that purpose in mind, when I want to capture it in some way or another, like I feel that's a way for me to also connect closer to that space and kind of zoom in on the shapes, the
Right.
details, the atmosphere. Then, later when you get back home, the act of recreating that in a video or kind of editing it together, that, is something that for me almost makes it more real in a sense. It's almost like I'm holding the actual pieces of like what would otherwise be like a memory that's
Right.
doomed to fade away.
Yeah.
But instead, like I have these tangible artifacts now that I can cut together in a way that feels representative of the experience that I had and that I can carry along with me. And so that in that sense, it's also something that for me kind of helped me to make certain experiences more tangible and make certain things like places or people that you encounter along the way more real, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even though you're obviously dealing with a creative representation of it.
Yeah, I don't want to portray it as entirely negative, and I definitely also experience, I think, what you're saying, and we see it in this movie a little bit too, where is kind of there's this sense in which him filming things, especially with like the camping, is allowing him to actually see things for what they are, or gives him a perspective on things that he wouldn't otherwise have. And I definitely feel that as well with working on certain things, whether it's a video essay or trying to film certain things. There's a sense in which the awareness that you need to try to capture and represent what you're seeing not only makes you look at the thing more closely, but then also can kind of just draw you into that in a way that opens you up to having a perspective about it that you might not otherwise. And that, I think that can be really, really valuable. And it isn't just purely an escape or a detachment. But, I think it's fair to acknowledge that it can be sometimes. I wish I could remember more specifically what she says, but his younger sister is kind of accusing him of this. There's that scene where he's working on the film right after the divorce, and she comes in and she's kind of like saying, like, you just use this you're just like mom in that you're kind of like out here focused on these other things when there's like, something bad happening, right? You're kind of using this as an escape. And I think it's fair to acknowledge that relationship.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And then I think the other thing I would say is I just like that the movie kind of sidesteps like any super romanticized portrayal of filmmaking, in that like he makes that film at high school and then suddenly he's the popular kid. It does kind of raise his popularity a little bit, and it kind of changes his relationship with Logan a little bit. It makes him connect with Logan, and then Logan stands up for him. So, maybe that's a little bit of what I'm talking about. But it's not like perfect. It's not like...
It's not like and then everyone stood up.
Right, and clap. I mean, they do all literally clap, but it's not in I don't know. It doesn't like his girlfriend isn't magically back with it. It doesn't like everything isn't put perfectly back in place. And there's this sense in which like, I just liked that he seemed to be, I felt like accurately kind of representing what felt like a portrayal of the art form and his participation in the art form.
Yeah, just easy.
That wasn't like a caricature in one direction or the other.
Yeah, exactly. It was basically just the path of the creative person to some extent.
Yeah.
And just to add one more comment on what you said about using film in this case to kind of open things up that you otherwise wouldn't see. Like we obviously see that literally in the movie when he's kind of going back and forth through the footage, and then as he discovers the affair that his mom had, and there's this kind of extended sequence where he just goes back and forth and then pauses it and rewinds and plays it in slow motion. And so in that sense, you see that the way the act of filming also gives him a sense of control of his own life and his own being within it, but which is the benefit of it. But then, as you said, I think the scene where the parents divorce and he's kind of aloof in the background, that's the definitive commentary, I think, on the downside of it all. And that that when there is a moment where you want to be present like more than anything, that's when you're gonna end up falling short, I think.
Yeah.
Because that's when it becomes difficult to separate, like, or to distinguish between, okay, am I looking at this as Sam the filmmaker, or just Sam the person that has to be there just maybe for his sister, for his parents, and can't because he's the kind of person who now kind of looks through the lens, symbolically in this sense, as we see in the mirror shot. But yeah, and about Logan, one more thing. I just like the way that was so kind of a goofy sequence. And I liked that because I initially thought it was going to be like, oh, he shows Logan as the hero in that movie. And so Logan, he's like, oh, he showed me like, I'm the man now. And he thinks I'm cool. And so I think he's cool too now. But I like that instead what that movie actually did was it opened like this whole can of worms like within Logan's psyche. Like, like, it kind of broke him psychologically in a way that feels like a win for Sam, but it obviously wasn't intended that way. Right. And I don't know. I like that in that little moment, like someone like Logan suddenly had so much more character depth. Like because you could see now he was kind of struggling with imposter syndrome or like inadequacy issues, where when he's someone who's constantly being praised as star athlete or most popular guy in school or whatever, well, while secretly like he's struggling with like these severe issues, and then you have Sam kind of unknowingly or accidentally like pushing him over the edge in that sense. But I guess that's, maybe for Logan, you can imagine that was a cathartic moment too, that he finally had. I guess that's maybe where there's like the subtle nod to, the power of cinema, and cinema can be transformative, and that's the thing that made Logan finally break, even though, it doesn't end up being that relevant to Sam's story or Spielberg's story, but it's still, I just like the way that, which on paper could have been this very superficial scene, added so much depth to that with very little, it was seemingly effortless in the way it just handled that whole thing.
I thought that was a really surprising, like you're saying, it took me so off guard when he comes in and you're expecting one response from him and he's just kind of like tripping out and like almost angry instead. That's one of the strongest scenes in the movie, I think, in terms of just like two of the actors kind of having this dramatic like dialogue, and the way in which like you're surprised by kind of how both of them are handling the situation. Yeah, I thought that was a really good moment that was also kind of unexpected and counterintuitive.
Yeah, I think from there we've pretty much covered the main
storyline
portion of the movie.
Yeah.
I'm kind of struggling to remember where exactly it ended before the John Ford sequence, or it makes a little time jump at the end.
I think the divorce happens right before the prom and the film he screens. And then there's the scene where he goes and talks to his mom. She's kind of asking him to forgive her. And then shortly after that, we jump to him in Hollywood with his dad, living with his dad. And he's kind of trying to go to school and also get filmmaking jobs on the side. And we kind of finally see his dad sort of like give up on his, you shouldn't do filmmaking, it's just a weird hobby. He kind of finally gets this sort of affirmation from his dad of like, okay, yeah, go ahead, like do filmmaking. Yeah. And then we go into, he also gets this letter from, I guess, the producer of Hogan's Heroes, which was a funny moment in the theater because I used to watch Hogan's Heroes and I had completely forgotten about it as a show. And then it popped up in this movie and I was like, oh, Hogan's Heroes is a thing that existed. I forgot about that. I don't know if you've ever watched it or seen The Great Escape, but it literally is a show where somebody was like, oh, The Great Escape is a good movie. What if we made that as a comedy sitcom? And I don't know if it's actually a funny movie or a funny show. Like, I haven't watched it in years, but it's a real show that is really quirky. But yeah, then he goes there, he gets his job, and he gets to meet the greatest filmmaker, the greatest director of all time, David Lynch, as John Ford. And we already kind of talked about that, but That scene, I didn't realize David Lynch was in it. And then
I thought it was when he first walked in. I thought it was the guy. I'm blanking on his name now. He's the. I think he was in the Pirates movies and in The King's Speech.
I think I know. Yeah,
Jeffrey
Gregory Rush. Yeah,
Jeffrey Rush.
Jeffrey Rush.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought it was him for a second, and then I was like, wait, that's kind of looks like David Lynch. But
that scene in general is just great and really funny.
Yeah.
You know, he gets this little piece of advice, which is put the horizon at the bottom or at the top. And then he kind of walks off into the sunset after that. And there's that nice little final ending moment where the camera adjusts from having the horizon in the middle to putting it at the bottom, which to me, we talked about the fact that there was no based on a true story, you know, dedicated to my mom and dad, like line in this film. But that little adjustment at the end to me is just kind of like the little Steven Spielberg signature at the end, where it's kind of like, oh, the person making this movie is Sammy. Like that just kind of like is a nice little like kind of signature at the very end there.
Yeah, I like the way the composition is. You have the street and then the two kind of seemingly identical buildings on the side. So especially after that scene where it draws attention to the horizon, it's a scene that has like those very clear leading lines that really draw your attention to the perspective. And so I remember thinking like, oh, is he really going to end the movie with the horizon exactly in the middle now? And then you had that last moment. Oh, I barely had finished the thought, and then the camera tilts up, and I was like, okay, I see what you're doing there.
It's moments like that I was like, you know, this movie, for me, just as someone who's like a fan of filmmaking, a fan of Steven Spielberg, is like delightful. I mean, we could talk about, it could have been like, you know, 50% bad and not that interesting. And just for kind of those little inside jokes and moments, I would have been like, this is fun. But I'm glad that on top of those things, we got, you know, a very heartfelt, personal, and I think like genuinely dramatic and interesting story about someone's path to becoming sort of an artist, and some of the like pitfalls and struggles along the way with that.
Yeah, and just coming to terms with one's own history in a way, you know, almost in the sense that we all also talked about with After Sun. But,
I thought about that as well.
Yeah. I want to go back just a moment to that final scene with the mother. We kind of skipped over it just now, but what did you think of that, the way that played out? She makes the decision at the end to go live with Bernie. So she also, in a way, makes a sacrifice a sacrifice on her family's part to kind of pursue her own happiness.
Yeah.
And I really liked the line that she had where she said, "You don't owe your life to anyone," or I think it was something along those lines. I was just curious what were your thoughts on that? What did you make of that scene?
I'm not really sure what to make of her, or like her character and the whole arc between the parents. I think that part of the movie is one that it's harder for me to relate to, because that doesn't, my childhood experience is different. My parents are still together. That's like, unlike the art bits and, you know, relationship with a creative pursuit, I don't have a personal connection to that kind of story.
Yeah.
Which is fine. You know, I can still appreciate it. But I don't know what to. I felt like it was a really kind of like After Sun. I liked that his portrayal of both of his parents, I felt like did a really good job of kind of showing them and also like how he's portraying filmmaking, I think, in this sort of unromantic light where you get to see the things about them that he really took from, and like there's parts about his dad where it's like he learned all these things from his dad, and he learns a lot and takes a lot from his dad, but there was also sort of a denial and obliviousness and sort of detachment that his dad seemed to have at times. And he just kind of portrays that in a very straightforward light. His mom, it's a little bit more complicated, but I think there's a similar thing going on where you can kind of appreciate the sort of romanticism and her like spirit, her playful spirit and sort of her love of art and all these things and how that would have influenced him. But then you also get to see the more conflicted sides of that and like the impact that has on like her family and just, kind of the dramatic tension of that. What was your take on sort of the mom?
I also couldn't relate directly. Like my parents are also still together, but for me, I think it was mostly about, or the thing that I did find relatable is that process of, or that kind of transformation that happens when you come of age, when you realize, or you come to see your parents not as mom and dad, but as individual people who have their own personhood, basically their own dreams and desires. And I think that in the film, you initially have Sammy holding a lot of contempt for his mother, I think, because he's kind of blaming her for not living up to her role as the mother. He's kind of blaming her for not being the right person that family needs. And I think at the end, he comes to realize that, she's not just supposed to be the mother of this family. She is her own person too, and she has her own vision of happiness, or she has her own, not necessarily a vision. She knows basically what leads to her being happy and what leads to her being not happy. And that's why she makes that choice. And I feel like that's the point that Sam can relate to at that moment, because he too knows that struggle. Like maybe he also realized to some extent that he wasn't always the son, or like the son he had to be within the family, because he also wanted to be his own person. And so that's maybe like the sort of that coming together there at the moment, is sort of realization that his mom might want to do the same as he did, or at least that she deserves to have that same choice. And so I feel like that's where they kind of finally end up meeting each other again. I did like how that played out, and that's to me why that quote felt so powerful to me in that moment, where she says that you don't owe your life to anyone. And I feel like in many ways there's a lot of truth in that, not in the sense like, oh, you're free to do whatever you want, you don't have responsibilities to anyone, but I feel like more in the sense when it comes down to it, like your own fundamental happiness, you have to like take agency of that. And that's ultimately, if it's within your power to kind of move that into a certain direction, or in a direction that you feel like you have to take, then that's what you got to do.
That's kind of reflected in the Uncle Boris scene too, where he's kind of like, you're gonna join the circus, and he's, they're setting up that whole conflict. And in becoming a filmmaker, his dad does finally give in, but he's kind of having to go against what his dad wants for him, which is like, hey, become an engineer, go to school, do something real and important, is kind of what his dad's position. And in order for Sammy to become Steven Spielberg, he has to go, no, Dad, it's not a hobby. I'm going to go do this thing because I like doing it and it's meaningful to me. So yeah, I think there's an interesting through line kind of through all of those.
Yeah. just popping into my head, but this is an extreme overanalyzation, but I can see even why the whole movie is like fictional characters or fictional names, and because it isn't until the very end that Sam Fabelman becomes Steven Spielberg.
Right.
Don't quote me on that.
Tom said, I like the weird fictionalization of, apparently in and I don't want to quote that whole DGA interview, but in the DGA interview, Spielberg says that the only name they didn't change was Uncle Boris's.
Yeah, but it is kind of weird when you think about it, when he takes so much, or he ends up taking so much almost verbatim from his own past. Why bother changing names,
I don't know. I kind of like it because it nods to the fact that it is, I think that's why I was surprised, part of why I was surprised how accurate it was, but ultimately it still is a fictionalization, even if he's ripping a lot of it more directly than maybe it would have seemed at first glance.
Yeah, just a nice little distance between Steven Spielberg, the person, and the his own mythologized version in this. Which movie made you feel the magic of movies more? Was it the Fabelmans or the final montage at the end of Babylon?
I gotta say the Fabelmans, I think. Like, there was some moments earlier in Babylon that, you know, I really loved, but as far as pure love of filmmaking, the Fabelmans kind of captured some of those elements a little bit more. But it also aligns more with my own experience of, you know, just kind of going out with a camera and the love of like just shooting a bunch of stuff or trying to like patch together this little film and then showing it to people. That was something I did as a kid. And there is sort of just like a really fun aspect of that it doesn't really get represented often in film. So yeah, I think for me, this one did it a little bit more in terms of just like, hey, movie making is fun. What about you?
Yeah, probably the same. I liked Babylon a lot, probably more than most people. I think people have been coming around to it, and I feel like I'm kind of wanting to watch it again to get my like definitive judgment. But yeah, we've already talked about Babylon. It's this month's bonus episode, which you can check out on Nebula. Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original show, meaning that here you can experience our podcast ad-free, listen to all of our episodes a week early, and get instant access to bonus episodes like the one on Babylon that we have done this month. Before that, we've also covered Avatar: The Way of Water, the new All Quiet on the Western Front, and many, many others at this point. It's basically like a whole new catalog of movies. So yeah, all that's on Nebula, and you can even get access to that with a $20 discount if you use our personal link. That's nebula.tv/cinema of meaning. Yeah, you can also find that link in the show notes. So yeah, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you again next time.